Mall security footage didn't tell the full story, and Nolan knew it. Sitting in his office, watching grainy clips of employees at his 14-location security company, he felt something wasn't right. Customer complaints had increased, response times were slower, and employees were allegedly slacking off. But every report he received from management painted a different picture, one where everything was under control. Matthew had inherited the company from his father, who built it from the ground up. For years, it had a reputation for professionalism and safety, but lately, that reputation was slipping. He wasn't about to let his father's legacy crumble. Tired of hearing second-hand accounts, he made a decision. He would go undercover as a janitor at one of the busiest malls where his company provided security. He chose this location because it had the most complaints both from customers and retail managers. To ensure no one recognized him, he took precautions. He grew out his stubble, dyed his hair darker, and got a cheap uniform from a third-party cleaning service the mall used. He had never met most of the security guards personally, as hiring and training were handled by district managers. By the time he walked into the mall, pushing a mop bucket, he looked like just another overworked janitor. His first day undercover started rough. A store manager yelled at him for mopping too slow. A teenager knocked over a drink without apologizing, and several security guards ignored him like he was invisible. But he was here for one reason: to observe. Near the food court, he spotted two security guards standing around, chatting, while a group of rowdy teens harassed customers. One of the guards, a tall guy with a shaved head, scrolled through his phone. The other, a stocky man in his 40s, laughed at something on the screen. Matthew narrowed his eyes. Weren't they supposed to be handling situations like this? He kept moving, listening as he worked. Most guards seemed disengaged, barely looking at anything beyond their phones or the clock. Then he noticed someone different. Near the escalators, a security guard in his late 20s stood alert, scanning the area. He had a serious but approachable look, his uniform crisp compared to the others. The name tag read Derrick. Matthew kept an eye on him. A few minutes later, an elderly woman struggled with a heavy shopping bag near the escalator. She looked exhausted, her hands trembling as she tried to adjust the weight. None of the other guards noticed, but Derrick did. He walked over immediately. "Ma'am, let me help you with that." She hesitated at first, but he gave her a reassuring nod and gently took the bag. "Where are you headed?" "The parking lot," she said, her voice shaky. "Let me walk you there." Matthew watched as Derrick guided her toward the exit. He didn't just carry her bag, he walked at her pace, making sure she was steady. When they reached the parking lot, he waited until she safely got into her car before heading back inside. Matthew felt something tighten in his chest. This was the kind of employee his company needed, someone who actually cared. But as Derrick returned, the stocky security guard from earlier shook his head. "Man, why do you waste your time with stuff like that?" Derrick frowned. "She needed help." "That's not our job," the other guard scoffed. "We're here to stop shoplifters, not carry bags for old ladies." Derrick's jaw tightened. "We're here to make people feel safe." Matthew clenched his fists. This was exactly the problem. Some guards treated the job like a paycheck, not a duty. He wasn't done watching. Matthew continued working, pushing his mop bucket through the crowded mall corridors while keeping a close eye on the security team. The more he observed, the clearer the divide became. Some guards barely paid attention to their surroundings, while Derrick remained alert, scanning the area with a sense of duty that the others lacked. As the afternoon stretched on, Matthew saw Derrick respond to several incidents, small things that most of the other guards ignored. He stepped in when a child got separated from his parents, calmly guiding the panicked mother to the lost and found desk. When a kiosk vendor struggled to chase down a teenager who had snatched a phone case from their stand, Derrick didn't hesitate. He quickly intercepted the teen near the exit, retrieving the stolen item without unnecessary aggression. Matthew noted Derrick's approach firm but never hostile, always treating people with respect. It was exactly the kind of professionalism the company was supposed to stand for. But not everyone shared Derrick's values. Near one of the larger department stores, Matthew overheard a conversation between two other security guards, the same ones who had been slacking near the food court earlier. They leaned against a metal railing, casually chatting while a woman nearby struggled with two young children and a stroller with a broken wheel. One of the guards, the stocky one, let out a short laugh. "Man, I don't know why Derrick tries so hard. No one cares about this job that much." The other guard, the one with the shaved head, shrugged. "He's making us look bad." The first guard scoffed. "Nah, makes him look like a fool." Matthew's grip on the mop tightened. He had seen enough to know that Derrick was one of the few employees taking the job seriously, while others treated it like a chance to stand around doing nothing. Then, something happened that forced Matthew to act. A commotion broke out near the entrance of a high-end jewelry store. A man in a dark hoodie rushed out, clutching something in his hand. The store alarm blared as a panicked employee shouted for help. Matthew instinctively turned toward Derrick, who was already moving. Derrick sprinted toward the thief, weaving through the crowd with practiced agility. The suspect bolted toward the nearest exit, but Derrick anticipated his route, cutting him off before he could reach the doors. The man hesitated for a second before attempting to shove past, but Derrick sidestepped and firmly grabbed his arm, preventing an escape without excessive force. He kept his voice steady but commanding, ensuring the suspect knew there was no easy way out. It was the kind of response Matthew expected from a trained professional: quick thinking, controlled action, and zero unnecessary aggression. But then, the two lazy guards finally decided to act. Instead of assisting Derrick, they arrived late and immediately escalated the situation. The stocky one grabbed the suspect roughly and shoved him against the wall, while the other pulled out his baton unnecessarily. Derrick immediately stepped in between them. "Hey," he said, his voice firm. "He's already detained, no need for that." The stocky guard rolled his eyes. "You're too soft, man." Derrick didn't back down. "We follow procedure. We're not here to throw people around." The suspect, a young man who looked barely out of his teens, trembled as Derrick held up a hand to keep the other guards from going any further. A moment later, mall management arrived, followed by local law enforcement. The officers took over, thanking Derrick for handling the situation professionally. Matthew had seen enough. His heart pounded as he realized how much his company had drifted from the standards his father had built. Some of the employees were failing not just at their jobs, but at understanding what security was really about. He wasn't going to let it slide. Matthew had seen enough. His heart pounded as he gripped the mop handle, watching as Derrick de-escalated the situation while the other two guards stood off to the side, clearly irritated that he had taken control. The suspect, now in the hands of the arriving mall security manager and local authorities, looked shaken but unharmed. Derrick had done everything by the book, while the other two had nearly turned a simple apprehension into an unnecessary show of force. Matthew's decision was made. He couldn't stay undercover a second longer. He left the mop bucket where it was and walked directly toward the security office near the employee-only corridor. The hallway smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, the walls lined with faded notices about policy and protocol. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The mall's security manager, a man named Greg, sat behind a cluttered desk, sipping from a chipped mug. He barely looked up when Matthew entered. "Janitorial supplies are down the hall," Greg muttered, setting his mug aside. Matthew pulled off the cheap baseball cap he had been wearing to complete his disguise. "I'm not here for that." Greg finally glanced up, his face twisting in confusion before his eyes widened with recognition. He sat up straighter. "Mr. Nolan." His voice wavered between shock and concern. Matthew nodded. "We need to talk." Greg scrambled to his feet, his demeanor shifting from dismissive to overly attentive. I didn't know you were coming today." That was the point. Matthew's voice was steady, but the intensity behind it was undeniable. "I've spent the last few days watching how this location operates. I'm not impressed." Greg swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting on the desk. "Sir, if I'd known you were coming, I would have made sure," Matthew cut him off. "That's exactly the problem. I shouldn't have to announce myself for things to be done right." There was no argument to be made against that. Greg's mouth opened slightly, then closed as he looked away. Matthew took a controlled breath. I saw guards ignoring disturbances, standing around on their phones and failing to uphold the basic responsibilities of their job. And when one of them actually did his job correctly, others tried to undermine him. Greg's face reddened. I'll speak to them. We'll fix it. You'll do more than that. Matthew's eyes were sharp. Tell me, what's your hiring process like? Greg hesitated. We do background checks and make sure they have the required certifications. That's not what I asked. Matthew leaned in slightly. Do you actually screen for the right kind of people? Or do you just fill positions to meet numbers? Greg shifted uncomfortably. We try to find the best candidates, but it's hard to get people who want to do this kind of work for the pay. Matthew's jaw tightened. He had suspected this was part of the problem. The company had once prided itself on hiring security personnel who cared about safety, not just a paycheck, but somewhere along the way that standard had slipped. I watched Derrick today, Matthew continued. He handled every situation with professionalism while others stood around doing nothing, and when it came time to actually act, they made things worse instead of better. Greg rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. Derrick's one of our best, no doubt about that. So why isn't he in a leadership position? Greg blinked, caught off guard. Matthew pressed on. You let the wrong people set the tone here. That's going to change. Greg nodded quickly. I can start making adjustments. Matthew shook his head. Not start, effective immediately. Those two guards that nearly escalated the situation with the suspect, they're done. Greg hesitated. You want them fired. I want them gone, Matthew confirmed. They don't belong here. Greg exhaled heavily but nodded. Understood. Matthew wasn't finished. Derrick needs to be promoted. He should be leading, not taking orders from people who don't care. Greg scratched his chin. I guess that makes sense. He's got the right attitude, and the other guards do respect him more than they admit. Matthew wasn't interested in hesitation. Make it happen today. Greg nodded quickly. I'll take care of it. Matthew turned to leave, but then paused at the door. One more thing. I'll be making unannounced visits from now on. If I see this kind of negligence again, it won't just be the guards losing their jobs. Greg paled but nodded. Understood, sir. Matthew walked out without another word. He had come undercover to find the truth. Now, he was making sure that truth led to real change. Matthew left the security office with his decisions set in stone. The moment he stepped back into the main corridors of the mall, the atmosphere felt different, not because the place had changed, but because he now knew exactly what had to be done. He spotted Derrick near the food court, standing with his hands on his belt as he scanned the crowd. The same focus, the same quiet efficiency. The man was doing his job as if nothing had happened, despite the fact that he had just prevented a minor disaster. Matthew walked up to him, and this time Derrick noticed. His expression was neutral, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Matthew took a steady breath before speaking. He told Derrick everything, who he was, why he had gone undercover, what he had seen. Derrick listened without interrupting, his expression shifting only slightly as the truth unfolded. When Matthew finished, there was a long pause between them. Derrick finally exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't shocked, more like processing the weight of what had just been revealed. Matthew didn't wait for a response, he laid it all out. The two guards who had failed in their duties. Gone, the leadership at this location, restructured, and Derrick, promoted, effective immediately. Derrick's brow furrowed. He looked at Matthew, then at the bustling mall around them, as if trying to ground himself in reality. The first thing he asked was how Matthew had come to his decision, not in disbelief, not out of arrogance, just genuine curiosity. Matthew told him the truth. It wasn't just about the attempted theft or the way Derrick had handled it. It was everything, the attention to detail, the way he treated people, the way he didn't hesitate to do the right thing even when others dismissed it. Derrick nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the moment. Then he asked something Matthew hadn't expected. What would change for the rest of the guards? Matthew had already thought about that. The problem wasn't just individual failures, it was the culture that had been allowed to fester. That meant new hiring practices, stricter oversight, and more unannounced evaluations at every location. It meant making sure that the people wearing the uniform understood the responsibility that came with it. Derrick listened carefully, then gave a slow nod. He accepted the promotion, but not before asking if he could have input on the training process going forward. Matthew agreed without hesitation. By the time they parted ways, the weight in Matthew's chest had shifted. He had come into this thinking he would find a few bad employees. Instead, he had uncovered something deeper, a company that had started to drift from the values it was built on. That was ending today. As he walked back toward the mall exit, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Near the escalators, an elderly man struggled with a heavy shopping bag, his face etched with frustration as he tried to adjust his grip. Before Matthew could move, Derrick was already on it. Without hesitation, without being asked, he stepped forward to help. Matthew didn't need to see anything else. This was how things were supposed to be, and from now on, he would make sure they stayed that way. Matthew didn't return to headquarters right away. Instead, he stayed at the mall for the rest of the day, watching as the changes he had set in motion began to take effect. Greg, the mall's security manager, wasted no time in dismissing the two guards who had shown negligence. They were pulled aside privately, their dismissals handled swiftly but professionally. There was no grand spectacle, no dramatic confrontation, just accountability. Derrick, despite the sudden promotion, didn't change his demeanor. If anything, he seemed even more focused. He continued patrolling, assisting customers when needed, and keeping an eye on the general flow of activity. The remaining guards, now operating with the knowledge that their boss had been secretly among them, carried themselves with a new awareness. Some had been slacking before, comfortable in the assumption that no one was watching. That comfort was gone. Matthew noticed subtle changes almost immediately. Guards checked in on store managers more frequently, ensuring that retail employees felt supported. The usual clusters of security personnel standing around chatting had disappeared. Even Greg, who had previously been content to manage from a distance, was more present on the floor, making direct rounds instead of staying in his office. It was a start. As the evening rolled in and the mall grew quieter, Matthew finally stepped outside. The parking lot lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. He leaned against a concrete pillar, taking a moment to process everything. There was still more to fix. His company had grown too quickly, and with that growth, standards had slipped. If this mall's security team had these problems, what about the other locations? How many more Derricks were being overlooked? How many more disengaged employees were collecting paychecks without taking the job seriously? He wasn't going to wait for reports and filtered updates anymore. Unannounced site visits would become a regular part of his leadership. Not just undercover stings, real, face-to-face interactions with employees at every level. He had spent too much time in meetings, relying on second-hand accounts. That was over. The next morning, he arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. The main office was a sleek, modern space designed to impress clients. Frosted glass doors, polished floors, and a reception desk staffed with a well-dressed administrative team. It looked good on the surface, but Matthew now understood how little that meant if the foundation wasn't solid. His first order of business was calling a leadership meeting. The regional managers, district supervisors, and department heads gathered in the conference room, some looking curious, others uneasy. They had heard about what happened at the mall. Matthew wasted no time. He laid everything out plainly, detailing the failures he had witnessed firsthand. He didn't hold back, making it clear that the culture of complacency was ending immediately. Hiring practices would change, training programs would be revamped, leadership would be held accountable. Bonuses and promotions would no longer be based on tenure alone, but on actual performance and commitment to the company's values. There was no pushback. No one dared argue against what he had seen with his own eyes. After the meeting, he made another decision. He called Derrick directly. Derrick answered with a level of professionalism that impressed Matthew, despite the unexpected nature of the call. He didn't sound overly excited or overly cautious, just steady, as always. Matthew told him that his promotion wasn't just about a title change. He wanted Derrick to be involved in shaping the company's future. His perspective, his experience on the ground, those were valuable. Too often, decisions were made at the top without input from the people actually doing the work. That was going to change. Derrick didn't hesitate to accept. By the end of the day, Matthew felt something he hadn't in a long time: a sense of clarity. He had built this company on the foundation his father laid, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what made it strong in the first place. It wasn't just about contracts and expansion. It was about people, the right people. And from now on, he would make sure they were the ones leading the way.